For Soviet citizens who grew up and lived in the 1980s, the Afghan War was a powerful source of psychological trauma. In terms of its impact and symbolic significance, it was comparable to the Vietnam War for U.S. citizens. It was not just a military campaign in a distant country, but a profound social and moral crisis that undermined faith in ideals, propaganda, and even the system itself. Perhaps there comes a moment in the fate of every superpower when it becomes embroiled in a conflict that becomes its long-term pain, a war that turns into a multi-layered crisis, political, economic, social, and, most importantly, psychological. For the Soviet Union, Afghanistan became such a war. The conflict lasted almost a decade, claimed the lives of thousands of soldiers and officers, forever changed the fate of their families, and ultimately brought the country neither victory nor benefit, only bitterness, fatigue, and disappointment. The Afghan War only exacerbated international tensions. Because of it, relations between the USSR and the West were on the verge of breaking down, the arms race accelerated, and the fear of a new, now nuclear, world war began to hang in the air again, as it had during the height of the Cold War. Many seriously feared that Afghanistan would be the spark that ignited World War III. The world was once again on the brink of disaster. But what if the Soviet leadership had made a different decision in 1979? What if the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union had not given the order to send troops into Afghanistan? How much could this have changed the course of world history? Would the fate of the Soviet Union itself have changed? Or would everything have followed roughly the same scenario? This is the alternative path that we will try to explore in this video. My name is still Semyon, and you are watching the What If series. We officially declare it open and begin music. To understand how it all began, we need to go back a little. The Afghan War did not arise out of nowhere. Most modern viewers, especially the younger generation, have only heard fragments about it, without knowing the key details. Meanwhile, until 1979, the Soviet Union and Afghanistan had quite warm and pragmatic relations. Afghanistan was a key strategic point in Central Asia, not only in terms of military geography, but also as an ideological stronghold. The USSR strove with all its might to maintain its influence in the region and relied on loyal regimes. With the active support of the Soviet Union, roads, schools, hospitals, power lines, technical colleges, and medical centers were indeed built in Afghanistan. The USSR invested heavily in infrastructure development, sending engineers, doctors, and teachers. However, despite all these efforts, until the mid-1970s, Afghanistan remained an extremely backward country, agrarian, poor, with deep social stratification and a lack of even basic industry. An absolute monarchy continued to exist in the country, which for decades hindered any reforms. The literacy rate was catastrophically low. In rural areas, only a few people could read and write, and education among women was virtually non-existent. Almost the entire country lived in medieval conditions, with religious conservatism, a clan system, and a strong dependence on tribal traditions. These realities were causing increasing discontent in society. The Afghan people, especially the educated youth, the urban population, and army circles, were in dire need of change. It was this internal tension that led to the first serious political turning point in July 1973. A country that seemed peaceful at first glance suddenly found itself caught up in a whirlpool of political instability. At that time, while King Zahir Shah was in Italy on a diplomatic visit, his cousin Muhammad Daud, with the support of part of the army command, organized a bloodless coup and announced the abolition of the monarchy. Thus, the Republic of Afghanistan was proclaimed, and Daud himself became the country's first president. On the wave of revolutionary enthusiasm, Daud promised the people large-scale reforms, modernization, social justice, and improved living conditions. These promises were met with hope. Many truly believed that the country would embark on the path of progress. But, as often happens in politics, reality turned out to be far from the promises. Soon, Daud concentrated all power in his hands, effectively establishing a personal dictatorship. His regime was harsh. Mass repression, arrests, persecution, and killings of anyone who expressed dissatisfaction or disagreement with the new government began. Movements espousing radical or Marxist views were particularly harshly suppressed. Among the main opposition figures were members of the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, PDPA, Afghan communists oriented toward Marxism-Leninism and maintaining close ties with the USSR. Despite persecution, repression, and intimidation, the leaders of the PDPA not only managed to survive but also to preserve the party's underground structures. The main figure in the party at that time was Nur Muhammad Taraki, a charismatic and ambitious ideologue with connections in the army. Thanks to these connections and support within the armed forces, in April 1978, the party managed to organize a military coup, which went down in history as the Saur Revolution. During the uprising, Muhammad Daoud and virtually his entire family were killed. According to the official version, Daoud tried to resist, grabbing a weapon and opening fire on a group of parliamentarians who had come to him with an offer of voluntary resignation. But no matter how events unfolded, the fact remains. During the coup and the storming of the presidential palace, not only Muhammad Daoud himself was killed, but also 18 members of his family, including women and children. This mass and, in essence, demonstrative destruction of the former leader's family came as a shock even to many supporters of the new government. It instantly showed the world and the country that the methods used by the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, PDPA, would be anything but gentle and certainly not democratic. As they say, draw your own conclusions. However, the coming to power of Nur Muhammad Taraki and his party did not bring stability or the long-awaited prosperity of the people. On the contrary, rapid chaos ensued. The new government proved incapable of establishing complete control over the country. Almost immediately after the seizure of power, the Islamic opposition, united around a multitude of disparate but ideologically similar groups, became active. The Muslim clergy, tribal leaders, local authorities, and ordinary believers perceived the communists as a mortal threat to their way of life and faith. This was quite understandable. Many saw the PDPA as a direct continuation of Soviet policy, and the USSR at that time was waging a fierce anti-religious struggle, closing mosques, repressing the clergy, and promoting atheism. The communist government in Kabul, inspired by the example of the USSR, immediately embarked on large-scale reforms. Forced collectivization, attempts to eliminate the tribal system, the abolition of dowries, and the introduction of compulsory education for women. At first glance, all this might have seemed progressive, but in the Afghan context, it caused a real explosion. The reforms were perceived as a violent destruction of Islamic foundations and the traditional way of life, especially in rural areas, where the majority of the population lived. Spontaneous resistance arose against the new government, and within a few months after the PDPA's victory, a full-scale civil war broke out in the country. The Kabul government quickly realized that it was unable to hold on to power on its own. The only real support it could count on was the Soviet Union, its powerful northern neighbor, with which Afghanistan had decades of political and economic relations. In addition, there were personal ties between Taraki and the Kremlin. Even before coming to power, he had visited Moscow on several occasions, where he was received at the highest level and was perceived as one of their own, a reliable ally. Faced with internal chaos, Taraki began to insist on military assistance. He sent urgent telegrams to Moscow, made personal calls, and tried to convince them of the need for intervention. However, at first, the Soviet leadership was super careful. The leaders of the USSR, including Brezhnev, Andropov, and Ustinov, understood that sending Soviet troops into an independent country could have devastating international consequences. It would inevitably lead to a sharp deterioration in relations with the US and Western countries, provoke a new round of the Cold War, and jeopardize the strategic balance. But the situation in Afghanistan continued to deteriorate. In September 1979, there was a sharp turn. An acute conflict broke out within the PDPA itself. Hafizullah Amin, an ambitious and ruthless party leader, organized an internal coup. Taraki was removed from all posts, arrested, and soon, on Amin's tacit orders, killed. Thus, the Kremlin not only lost its protégé, but also found itself in a situation of complete uncertainty. The new leader aroused distrust and alarm among the Soviet leadership. Amin rapidly concentrated power in his own hands, purged the party ranks, eliminated competitors, and, most dangerously from Moscow's point of view, established contacts with the Americans. Rumors circulated that the CIA had established direct contact with him. This reversal was the last straw. The Kremlin decided that further delay was impossible. Fearing that Afghanistan might leave the Soviet sphere of influence and side with the US, the Soviet leadership made a fateful decision in December 1979 to change course and send troops into Afghanistan. It is extremely important to understand that Afghanistan has occupied and continues to occupy a strategically important position in the center of Eurasia for centuries. This mountainous country served as a kind of bridge between the Middle East, South Asia, and Central Asia, and therefore control over it, or at least political influence over it, was seen by the world's leading powers as the key to dominance in the region. Afghanistan has traditionally been an arena of geopolitical rivalry. As early as the 19th century, the interests of the Russian Empire and the British colonial power clashed here in the famous Great Game. At that time, both empires sought to establish control over this region, seeing it as a buffer between their spheres of influence. In the 20th century, the situation repeated itself, but this time with the participation of the USSR and the US. Afghanistan once again became a pawn in the global confrontation between the superpowers. By 1979, when an internal coup took place in Kabul and Hafizullah Amin came to power, the situation took a particularly alarming turn for the Soviet leadership. According to the Soviet Special Services, Amin openly sympathized with the US and may even have maintained direct secret contacts with them. In the highest circles of power in Moscow, among Brezhnev, Andropov, Ustinov, and other key figures in the Politburo, the conviction grew that if the USSR did not intervene immediately, Afghanistan could be lost as an ally. And that would mean disaster from a geopolitical point of view. The Soviet leadership feared that if they delayed, the power vacuum in Kabul would quickly be filled by the Americans. It was believed that American military bases, missile launchers, early warning systems, and other strategic weapons could be deployed on Afghan territory, literally a few hundred kilometers from the Soviet border. They were particularly concerned about the appearance of Pershing medium-range ballistic missiles, which had a range of over 1,500 kilometers and could strike targets throughout Central Asia. But even more dangerous were the Tomahawk cruise missiles. With a range of over 5,500 kilometers, they could theoretically reach Moscow, striking the heart of the USSR in a matter of minutes. Such a development was unacceptable to the Soviet leadership. It was seen as a direct violation of the balance of power and a mortal threat to national security. It was against the backdrop of these threats that a historic but fateful step was taken. In December 1979, the Soviet Union sent its troops into Afghanistan. The logic seemed ironclad: prevent a neighboring country from becoming an American springboard, protect the borders, and maintain influence in the region. However, in practice, everything turned out differently. Instead of a quick and controlled operation, the USSR found itself embroiled in a protracted, bloody, and demoralizing war. In response to the Soviet invasion, the US, NATO, and their allies dramatically stepped up their activities in the region. Massive arms shipments to the Afghan Mujahideen began via Pakistan, with a significant portion of these weapons supplied through CIA programs such as Operation Cyclone. Instructors, military advisors, and intelligence officers flooded into Afghanistan. Training camps were set up on Pakistani territory, where Islamist groups were taught how to use modern weapons, guerrilla warfare tactics, and sabotage. Among other things, the militants were supplied with American Stinger portable anti-aircraft missile systems, which became a real threat to Soviet aviation. The Soviet Union hoped for a quick stabilization of the situation and the establishment of a loyal regime. Instead, it encountered fierce resistance, supported at the international level, a protracted war, enormous human and material losses, international isolation, and a moral crisis within the country. As often happens in history, they wanted the best, but it turned out as always. What might have changed if the Soviet Union had not sent its troops into Afghanistan in December 1979? First of all, it is worth starting with the real losses, both human and material, suffered by the USSR during the years of this protracted and bloody war. According to official data, which most historians tend to trust, the Soviet Union lost about 26,000 people in Afghanistan. This number includes not only those killed in battle, but also those who died from wounds, disease, and those who went missing. Behind every number lies a destiny, a family, someone's sons, brothers, fathers. If the country's leadership had made a different decision, if the troops had never crossed the border into Afghanistan, all these people would probably still be alive. Thousands of families would not have lost their loved ones. Thousands of soldiers would not have returned home crippled or broken in spirit. However, human losses are only one side of the tragedy. The second, equally important side is economic. Waging war outside one's own territory always requires enormous resources, especially in such a remote and mountainous region as Afghanistan. According to estimates by American and Western European analysts, maintaining the Soviet contingent in Afghanistan cost Moscow up to $8 billion annually. To understand the scale of this, it was a colossal amount of money even by the standards of developed countries at the time, not to mention the state of the Soviet economy, which was already beginning to experience serious systemic difficulties in the early 1980s. Considering that the operation lasted almost 10 years, the total cost can be estimated at tens of billions of dollars spent on weapons, fuel and lubricants, supplies, logistics, compensation payments, and the restoration of equipment and infrastructure. And all this was done to keep in power a government that was distrusted by the majority of its own people. These funds could have been used for development within the country itself. In the early 1980s, the first ideas for modernizing the economy and carrying out cautious reforms began to take shape in the USSR, even before perestroika. If the state had had the necessary resources at its disposal, it could have directed funding toward these goals: upgrading industrial equipment, supporting agriculture, developing electronics, and strengthening infrastructure. The possibility of avoiding or at least mitigating the looming economic crisis was real. Without the war, which literally sucked billions out of the budget, the country could have been much better prepared for the internal and external challenges of the end of the decade. In addition, refraining from the invasion would most likely have helped avoid large-scale economic sanctions from the West. After the invasion of Afghanistan, the international community sharply condemned the actions of the USSR. The US and its allies boycotted the 1980 Olympic Games in Moscow, and restrictions were imposed on trade, cooperation, and the supply of high-tech equipment. All this seriously affected the scientific and technological progress of the Soviet Union, depriving the country of access to modern technologies, equipment, and investments. If the invasion had not taken place, the USSR could have continued to pursue a more pragmatic foreign policy, conclude lucrative economic agreements with Western countries, purchase modern production lines, and possibly gain access to international credit. Or perhaps everything would have turned out completely differently. Instead of being drawn into a grueling war, the Soviet Union could have focused on peaceful initiatives, economic cooperation, and rapprochement with the West. It is quite possible that we would have seen the gradual integration of the USSR and other socialist countries into the Western European economic space, perhaps not to the full extent, but in the form of limited, pragmatic cooperation, which was already beginning to emerge as part of the policy of détente in the 1970s. Strengthening trade relations, exchanging technologies, concluding energy agreements, cultural programs, participation in international organizations. All this could have given the Soviet Union a new chance for sustainable development and a soft transformation of the system without collapse and catastrophe. Instead, however, foreign policy took a sharp turn toward confrontation, and discontent began to brew within Soviet society, growing with each passing year. The Afghan War, which official propaganda tried to portray as an international duty, very quickly came to be seen as a senseless, bloody, and disastrous undertaking. The people did not understand why Soviet soldiers were dying on foreign soil, what they were fighting for, and who the enemy really was. This feeling was particularly acute among young families receiving death notices, mothers burying their sons, and soldiers and officers returning home disabled or with deep psychological trauma. More and more people began to realize that what was happening in Afghanistan was not a heroic mission, but a foreign war imposed from above, with no clear goal and no visible chance of victory. The longer the conflict lasted, the more obvious it became that it was impossible to defeat the Mujahideen. Despite its superiority in technology, numbers, and firepower, the Soviet army was bogged down in an endless confrontation with guerrilla forces supported by the United States, NATO countries, China, and Islamic states. The war was turning into a quagmire with no way out. It was draining not only the country's resources but also the morale of society. Historians and eyewitnesses agree. The Afghan War was one of the most important factors leading to the collapse of the USSR. As early as 1987, the Politburo began receiving analytical memos from high-ranking officials and military leaders, which stated explicitly that delaying the withdrawal of troops could accelerate the collapse of the Union by undermining public confidence and increasing internal instability. However, these warnings were ignored or disregarded. On the international stage, the Afghan adventure led to a serious weakening of the Soviet Union's geopolitical position. The image of the USSR as the liberator of peoples, cultivated since World War II, was finally destroyed. Western media and politicians used the Afghan campaign as a pretext for launching a large-scale information war. U.S. President Ronald Reagan openly called the USSR an evil empire, and this label became firmly entrenched in the public consciousness both in the West and in the country itself. The Soviet state became vulnerable to any information attack. Its actions were perceived as aggressive, its intentions as expansionist, and the system itself as totalitarian and incapable of dialogue. There were precedents for such pressure. Remember Hungary in 1956 or the suppression of the Prague Spring in 1968. But it was the invasion of Afghanistan that became the point at which world opinion finally turned away from the USSR. This event showed that the Soviet Union was prepared to use force beyond its own interests, in an independent state, to impose its ideology and political will. This undermined what little respect remained for the socialist model, even among those who had previously sympathized with it or hoped for its evolution. Within the country, the socialist system was also rapidly losing credibility. In fact, by the end of the 1980s, the country had begun to literally fall apart before our eyes. Social tensions were growing, the economy was falling apart at the seams, and confidence in the authorities was rapidly declining. The Afghan War was not just a difficult episode, it turned into a systemic error for which the whole country had to pay. And as if all the internal problems were not enough, another alarming consequence of the Afghan campaign emerged: the growing influence of Afghan extremist groups ideologically and organizationally linked to radical Islamism. These ideas began to spread across the border into the Soviet Central Asian republics, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, and the North Caucasus. Every year, more and more local residents, especially young people, succumbed to the influence of these radical sermons. This fueled separatist and anti-Soviet sentiments, which had previously been almost invisible or suppressed by force. Thus, it is quite possible that, had it not been for the Afghan campaign, the Soviet Union, even if it had not survived in the form we knew it, could at least have existed much longer. Without internal tensions, international isolation, losses, exhaustion, and the discrediting of its ideology, the USSR might have been able to carry out cautious reforms, modernization, and an attempt at transformation following the example of China. This alternative seems increasingly likely, given how catastrophic the consequences of the war in Afghanistan were. But what would have changed in the world if the Soviet Union had not sent its troops to Afghanistan? As I said earlier, Afghanistan has been a bone of contention for many centuries. In the 19th century, it was between the Russian and British empires, and in the 20th century, between the USSR and Western countries. It was a territory that not only had a strategic location at the crossroads of Eurasia, but also had enormous symbolic significance. Control over Afghanistan provided opportunities to influence Iran, Pakistan, India, the Middle East, and all of Central Asia. If the Soviet Union had refused to intervene militarily in 1979, it is almost certain that Afghan leader Hafizullah Amin would have continued his course of rapprochement with the United States. In that tense international situation, this would inevitably have led to the active construction of American military bases, airfields, interception stations, intelligence and logistics centers right on the southern borders of the USSR. Such a prospect caused real panic among the Soviet leadership. The possibility of facilities similar to those that the US had in Turkey, West Germany, or Japan appearing in Afghanistan was perceived as a direct threat to national security. Bases equipped with medium-range ballistic missiles, electronic intelligence, and aircraft could reach strategic targets on the territory of the USSR in a matter of minutes. This would have meant a radical change in the balance of power in the region, and not in favor of the Soviet Union. But if we look at the situation from another angle, it is not so clear-cut. Even if the Soviet Union had remained neutral and Afghanistan had deepened its ties with the US, such an alliance would hardly have been strong and long-lasting. Afghans are a proud, freedom-loving people with deeply rooted religious and tribal traditions. At that time, most of the population was still living in a tribal society, with a strong attachment to Islam, Sharia law, and traditional ideas about justice, the role of the family, honor, and social structure. For such people, the ideas of Western democracy, feminism, individualism, freedom of speech, and, even more so, secularism, could be perceived as a threat to their very way of life. So-called American values, especially in the form in which they are actively promoted today, would provoke not just distrust, but outright rejection among many Afghans. In the eyes of local residents, any external intervention easily transforms into an image of occupation, and friendship with Western countries quickly turns into suspicion of betrayal of faith and national interests. Therefore, it is quite possible that American influence, even without the introduction of troops, would very quickly become a trigger for a large-scale popular uprising, perhaps even more violent than in the case of the Soviet invasion. The United States could become as deeply embroiled in this conflict as it once was in Vietnam. Afghanistan could become a new Vietnam for the U.S., a long, bloody, senseless conflict with thousands of casualties and enormous costs. It is possible that other regional players would also be drawn into this hypothetical conflict. Iran is a Shiite state concerned about the rise of Sunni radicalism on its borders. China is a neighbor for whom stability in Xinjiang and on its western borders is critically important. And, of course, the USSR, which would still have to respond to instability in the region, perhaps under different circumstances, but no less serious. All this could have led to an even more devastating regional war, in which the U.S. would have found itself in the position of the evil empire, occupying a Muslim country under the pretext of fighting terrorism, radicalism, or defending democracy. In this scenario, it was the Soviet Union that could have strengthened its international position as a defender of traditional values, a fighter against imperialism, and a guarantor of stability. Perhaps this would even have given the socialist camp a second wind, enhancing the appeal of communist ideology in third world countries and among developing states. It is quite possible that in this alternative future, Afghanistan would have become for the U.S. what Vietnam was for them in the 1960s and 70s, a symbol of defeat, internal crisis, and moral exhaustion. It is even possible that as a result of this hypothetical conflict, the United States would have found itself on the verge of collapse or serious internal turmoil, economic, political, and social. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, having retained its strength and authority, could have survived 1991 in a completely different format, as a transformed but viable power. So, how do you like this alternative history? A history in which the Soviet Union does not send troops to Afghanistan, but the U.S., on the contrary, becomes hostage to a foreign culture, uncontrolled territory, and endless war? Where Washington, not Moscow, is called the evil empire. Where communism, instead of collapsing, undergoes modernization and gets a second wind. In any case, one thing is clear: history could have gone completely differently, and the situation in modern Afghanistan, Central Asia, and even the whole world would have been different. Better or worse? It's hard to say. Write in the comments what you think. Would the world be more just, stable, and safe? Or could everything have turned into an even greater catastrophe?